The sound of the pen was the first thing that broke me. It was a cheap ballpoint, the kind you get from a bank, but in the vast, echoing terminal of LAX, it sounded like a crack of thunder. A thin, black, definitive line drawn straight through my name on the passenger manifest, Tony Anderson. Gone. I had arrived an hour early, a ridiculous feat for a 69-year-old woman who lived only 20 minutes from the airport, but my heart had been thrumming with a nervous, youthful excitement I hadn't felt in years. I wore the new coral dress I'd bought just for this trip, a soft, flowing linen that made me feel vibrant, alive. My pearls, a gift from my late husband, rested coolly against my skin, a quiet statement of dignity. I felt visible. For the first time since Lauren had married into the family, I felt like I was about to be seen again. But the woman I saw in the reflection of the check-in monitors glowing, hopeful, was a fool. David, my son, my only child, didn't even look at me as he did it. His eyes were fixed on the clipboard, his jaw tight. He simply crossed my name off the list for their Maui vacation and, right beside the black slash mark, he wrote another. Maya. There was a change of plans, Mom, he said, his voice clipped and cool, the same businesslike tone he used for everyone now. He wouldn't meet my gaze. His focus was on the luggage tags, on the passports, on anything but the woman whose heart he was actively tearing from her chest. Lauren, his wife, stepped forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. She offered me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a practiced expression of polite dismissal I had come to know intimately. We just thought it would be simpler this way, Tony, she said, her voice smooth as silk and just as suffocating. It's going to be a very active trip, lots of late nights, hiking, things that just don't fit with your age. For your own safety and energy, you understand. I didn't understand. All I understood was the black line through my name. I saw the cinnamon orange cake I had baked for David just yesterday, his childhood favorite, sitting on my kitchen counter, a pathetic offering to a son who had already discarded me. I saw the comfortable but chic shoes I'd spent a week searching for, the small, thoughtful gifts I'd wrapped for each of them tucked inside my suitcase, the new book I'd bought specifically for reading on a sun-drenched beach beside them. The story of how that sound, that single stroke of a pen, redefined my life is one I need to tell. It's a story I know some of you might understand in your own way, but before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. The final, most exquisite twist of the knife came from the woman standing beside Lauren, Maya. A friend of hers from yoga, maybe 25 years old, all tanned limbs and effortless confidence. She stepped forward, her smile a grotesque parody of sympathy. Tony, thank you so much for being so understanding, she chirped. As if I had offered her this spot, this ticket, this piece of my soul. Really, thank you for making this possible. Making this possible. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I was the facilitator. The enabler. The ATM and the live in-house sitter. Good enough to provide, but not good enough to participate. My gaze flickered to David, a silent, desperate plea. My son, look at me. Say something. Fix this. He finally looked up, but his eyes were empty. He cleared his throat. Mom, could you just head home? We'd really appreciate it if you could water the plants while we're gone. And maybe tidy up before we get back? It would be a huge help. And that was it. The world didn't stop. The bustling crowd in the terminal didn't pause to witness my public execution. The check-in agent simply called, "Next in line, please." And the family behind us shuffled forward, their own excitement, a bitter contrast to the acid filling my throat. They moved on. My son, his wife, and my replacement walked toward the security gate, their colorful luggage rolling smoothly behind them. They didn't look back. Tears I hadn't realized were gathering finally spilled over, hot and shameful, tracing paths down my cheeks. My body felt immensely heavy, rooted to the spot. The coral dress was no longer vibrant, it was a clown's costume. The pearls were a noose. I stood there, utterly alone in a sea of strangers, a ghost in the middle of LAX, my entire worth summed up by a single, brutal black line. It's funny what the mind clings to in the aftermath of a demolition. Not the explosion itself, but the small, quiet sounds just before. The scrape of a chair, the click of a lock. For me, it will always be the cheap, hollow scratch of a ballpoint pen. That thin black line wasn't just ink on paper, it was the final verdict on a lifetime of devotion. It was the sound of my own erasure. But to understand the depth of that black line, you have to understand the light that came before it. 3 weeks earlier, that light had a name. Hope. And it arrived, as it so often does, through the telephone. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, a day no different from the hundreds that had preceded it since my husband, Richard, passed. The silence in my West Side apartment was a physical presence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of traffic on Santa Monica Boulevard. I was rereading a novel I'd already read 5 times, not for the story, but for the simple companionship of the words. When the screen lit up with David's picture, my heart gave its usual, painful little lurch, a mix of love and dread. Our calls had become transactions, reminders about his car insurance, questions about old tax documents, arrangements for me to dog sit. They were brief, efficient, and always left me feeling like a line item on his weekly to-do list. I answered with the practiced calm of a mother who has learned not to expect too much. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hey, Mom." The difference was immediate. It was in the cadence, the warmth. The hurried, businesslike clip was gone, replaced by a softer, gentler tone I hadn't heard in years. It was the voice of the boy who used to build elaborate Lego cities on this very floor, the boy who would call me from college just to tell me about a funny professor. It was the voice I missed more than I ever let on. "How are you?" he asked, and he actually waited for the answer. I was so startled that I gave him the truth. "A little lonely, I suppose. But I'm all right." "Is everything okay?" He laughed, a genuine, warm sound that wrapped itself around my heart. "Everything's great, Mom. Actually, it's better than great. Lauren and I were talking, and we wanted to do something special for the family." My breath caught. The word family, in their lexicon, had slowly been shrinking. It started after they got married. First, it meant David, Lauren, and me. Then, it became David, Lauren, and their ever-expanding circle of friends, couples their own age who vacationed together, had brunches together, and celebrated holidays in ways that no longer included me. My role had become peripheral, that of a benevolent, invisible helper. I was the one who altered Lauren's dresses, the one who picked up their dry cleaning when they were slammed, the one who hosted Thanksgiving because Lauren found it too stressful, only to find myself clearing plates while they and their friends laughed over this bottle of wine I'd bought. It had been a slow, quiet erosion of my place in the world, a series of tiny paper cuts I was expected to ignore for the sake of harmony. Lauren was the architect of this new reality, of course. Her dismissals were always coated in a veneer of concern. "Oh, Tony, you wouldn't enjoy this crowd, they're so loud. We'd love to have you, but it's a late night, and we worry about you driving home. It's just a casual thing with friends, not really a family event." Each phrase was a polite little shove, pushing me further and further to the margins of my own son's life. And David, my kind, gentle David, let it happen. He wasn't cruel, he was absent. He allowed Lauren to become his spokesperson, his gatekeeper. He saw my loneliness, I know he did, but he chose the path of least resistance. He chose his wife's comfort over his mother's inclusion. Over time, I simply stopped expecting an invitation. It was easier than nursing the wound of being forgotten. "What kind of special thing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid the fragile hope blooming in my chest would wither if I spoke too loudly. "A trip, Mom," David said, his voice brimming with excitement. "A real vacation. All of us. We've booked a week in Maui. First-class tickets, a beautiful resort right on the water. I wanted to surprise you. We want you there with us." The silence that followed was filled with the frantic, disbelieving thump of my own heart. Maui. First class. We want you there. It felt like a dream, a fantasy I had long ago packed away with Richard's old photographs. The years of being sidelined, of feeling like a ghost in my own family, seemed to melt away in that single, beautiful sentence. I was being invited back in. I was being seen. Tears welled in my eyes, but these were not the hot, shameful tears of the airport. These were tears of gratitude, of overwhelming relief. "David," I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. "That's the most wonderful thing I've ever heard. I knew you'd be happy," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. The real smile, the one that reached his eyes. It's time we had a proper family trip again. Just us. Just us. After we hung up, I sat in my silent apartment for a long time, the phone still clutched in my hand, replaying his words over and over. A dam of unspoken grief I hadn't known I was holding back finally broke. I wept for the years of quiet holidays, for the unanswered texts, for the woman who had made herself smaller and smaller in the hopes of not being a burden. And then, I wept with joy. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in almost a decade. I went into the kitchen, pulled my old, flour-dusted recipe box from the shelf, and found the card, its edges softened with age, labeled in my own youthful script, "David's Cake." Baking it was a ritual, a prayer. The familiar weight of the flour sifter in my hand, the sharp, sunny perfume of orange zest scraped against the grater, the warm, woody spice of cinnamon. It was the scent of his childhood. It was the smell of a time when I was the center of his universe, the fixer of scraped knees and the baker of birthday cakes. As I creamed the butter and sugar, I remembered a 10-year-old boy with a galaxy of freckles across his nose, sneaking licks of batter from the bowl, his eyes wide with mischief and love. He was still in there, somewhere, behind the tailored suits and the weary expression of a man I barely recognized. This trip, I told myself, would bring him back. The cake rose in the oven, golden and fragrant, filling my quiet apartment with the aroma of love. I let it cool on the rack, its sweet, comforting scent a tangible manifestation of my hope. This wasn't just a cake. It was an offering. It was proof that I was ready, that I was still his mother, that I remembered every little thing that brought him joy. In that moment, I dared to hope for it all. I dared to believe that this trip was a turning point, a conscious effort by my son to reclaim our relationship from the polite, sterile distance where Lauren had marooned it. I let myself imagine the feel of the warm sand between my toes as we walked along the beach, the sound of our shared laughter echoing over the waves, the simple, profound joy of sitting across from my son at dinner and seeing him look at me, truly look at me, and smile. The hope was a key, unlocking parts of myself I had boarded up for years. It gave me permission to feel excited, to feel worthy of a beautiful experience. It sent me to the department store the next day, not to buy a sensible, invisible beige outfit, but to find that vibrant coral dress. It made me pull Richard's pearls from their velvet box, feeling not their sentimental weight, but their timeless elegance. I was not going on this trip as a feeble old woman to be managed and tolerated. I was going as Tony Anderson. As his mother. As a member of the family. The cake sat on my counter for a day, covered carefully in plastic wrap, a silent testament to my foolish, fragile, and boundless hope. The hope that I packed into my suitcase along with my books and my pearls. The hope that I wore like a second skin as I walked into Lax, my back straight, my head held high, ready, finally, to be included. Ready for a world that didn't include a cheap ballpoint pen and a single, brutal, black line. Hope is a meticulous architect. In the 3 weeks between that life-altering phone call and the day of the flight, it rebuilt my world from the inside out. The silent, gray apartment, once a tomb of memories and quiet resignation, became a vibrant staging ground for my own resurrection. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with the hum of anticipation. Every choice, every action, became a brick laid in the foundation of this new future I was allowing myself to believe in. It all began with a dress. I stood in the department store, a place I usually navigated with the sole purpose of finding something sensible, something that wouldn't draw attention. My hand hovered over a rack of navy blue and charcoal gray shirt dresses, the unofficial uniform of the forgotten older woman. They were practical. They were appropriate. They were invisible. For a moment, muscle memory took over, my fingers brushing against a familiar, safe navy polyester. It was the kind of dress Lauren would approve of, unremarkable, easy to ignore. But then, I heard David's voice in my head, the warmth of it, the echo of that single, beautiful phrase, "We want you there with us." I pulled my hand back as if the fabric were hot. No. I would not be invisible on this trip. I would not be a shadow trailing behind them, a service to be rendered. I was an invited guest. I was family. I turned and walked away from the muted colors, my heart beating a little faster. My steps took me toward a section of the store I hadn't dared to enter in years, a place of bright silks, bold patterns, and youthful cuts. And there it was. It hung on its own, almost as if it were waiting for me. The color was coral, but that word doesn't do it justice. It was the color of a tropical sunset, of life and warmth and unapologetic joy. It was a soft, breathable linen that promised to feel good against the skin in a warm Maui breeze. The cut was simple, elegant, flowing from the shoulders in a way that suggested movement and ease. Trying it on in the dressing room, I saw not a 6-9-year-old woman trying to look young, but simply, a woman. A woman with a soft smile and eyes that were beginning to sparkle again. The dress didn't hide my age. It celebrated the life I was living, right now. It was a declaration. I bought it without a second thought. The shoes came next. Lauren's voice was a critical whisper in my ear, full of her usual backhanded concerns. "Are you sure you can walk in those, Tony? We don't want you to fall." I imagined her pointing me toward orthopedic sneakers, the kind that scream frailty. I pushed the thought away. I found a pair of beautiful espadrille sandals with a low, sturdy wedge heel. They were stylish, chic, and utterly comfortable. They were the shoes of a woman who could keep up, a woman who intended to walk along the beach with her son, not be left behind in the hotel room. The final piece was the pearls. They had been Richard's last anniversary gift to me, and for 5 years, they had rested in their velvet box, too heavy with memory to wear. But as I clasped them around my neck, looking at my reflection in the coral dress, they felt different. They were no longer a relic of a past I had lost, they were a source of strength. They were a reminder of a man who had seen me, truly seen me, every single day for 47 years. They settled coolly against my skin, a quiet armor of dignity. Richard would have loved this dress. He would have loved that I was going. With my wardrobe decided, the ritual of packing began. It became a meditation, each folded item a tangible piece of my hope. I laid out my medications in their daily plastic organizer, a simple, practical task. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't a grim reminder of my body's limitations, but a competent act of self-care. It was me, preparing myself to be healthy and present for my family. Lauren saw my pillbox as a symbol of weakness. I now saw it as a tool for my independence. I chose a book I'd been saving, a novel about a woman who travels the world after a great loss. It seemed fitting. I tucked it into the side pocket of my suitcase, imagining myself reading it on our balcony, the sound of the ocean in the background, a cool drink sweating on the table beside me. Then came the gifts. My love language has always been giving, and this trip felt like an opportunity to speak it fluently again. I spent an entire afternoon searching for the perfect things. For David, I found a beautiful, handcrafted leather bookmark. He was always reading dense business books now, dog-earing the pages in his rush. But I remembered the teenage boy who loved fantasy novels, who treated his books with a reverence that was almost holy. The bookmark was a nod to that boy, a whisper of a shared past. I wrapped it in dark blue paper, his favorite color. For Lauren, I found a delicate silk scarf. The pattern was an abstract watercolor of hibiscus flowers in shades of lavender and seafoam green. I remembered her mentioning, just once, how much she loved those colors. It was a small detail she had probably forgotten sharing, but I had held onto it. The scarf was an olive branch, a silent gesture that said, "I see you, too, I want to connect." I wrapped it in silver paper and tied it with a white ribbon, elegant and understated, just like her. Placing those two small, perfectly wrapped gifts into my luggage felt like tucking my love into the seams of the trip itself. In the quiet evenings, my imagination took flight. I would close my eyes and transport myself to Maui. I saw us at dinner, the table lit by tiki torches, the air warm and sweet with the scent of plumeria. I saw David telling a funny story from work, Lauren laughing a real, genuine laugh, and me, sitting there, a part of it all. I imagined the weight and warmth of David's arm around my shoulders as we posed for a photo, our smiles unforced, our eyes reflecting the genuine happiness of a family reunited. The most persistent daydream was of a walk on the beach. In my mind, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. Lauren was back at the hotel spa, and it was just David and me. The silence between us was comfortable, companionable. He would finally talk to me, really talk to me, about the pressures of his job, his fears, his dreams. He would ask for my advice, not about finances or logistics, but about life. And I would listen, just as I had when he was a boy, offering not solutions, but unwavering love and support. In this fantasy, the years of distance would dissolve into the soft sand, washed away by the gentle tide. I would have my son back. The day of the flight, I woke before my alarm, a thrill of nervous energy coursing through me. I moved with a deliberate, joyful purpose. I showered, styled my hair, and put on the coral dress. As I fastened the pearls around my neck, I met my own eyes in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the faded, lonely widow who had haunted this apartment for 5 years. She was bright. She was ready. She was glowing. I watered the plants one last time, a small, domestic act that now felt like a prelude to adventure. I even tidied the house, not because David had asked me to, but because I wanted to return to a clean, peaceful space, my mind filled with new, happy memories. The cinnamon orange cake was still on the counter. I cut a small slice for my breakfast, the familiar flavor a perfect, sweet start to the day. I called the cab, my voice steady and clear. Arriving at LAX an hour early, I didn't feel anxious or foolish. I felt prepared, dignified. I tipped the driver generously and stepped out onto the curb, pulling my suitcase behind me. The chaotic energy of the airport, which usually felt overwhelming, was invigorating today. It was the sound of the world moving, of people going somewhere, and for the first time in a very long time, I was one of them. I walked through the automatic doors, my head held high, my pearl necklace cool against my skin, my coral dress a beacon of hope in the bustling terminal. I was looking for my son, ready for our new beginning, ready for anything, except for the cold, hard reality of a cheap ballpoint pen and a thin, brutal, black line. I found them near the Liberty Air check-in counter, their luggage a matching set of sleek, graphite gray suitcases I'd bought them for their wedding already lined up. My heart gave a joyful leap. The long weeks of anticipation were over, the dream was finally beginning. I straightened my shoulders, the soft linen of the coral dress rustling with the movement, and began to walk toward them, a wide, genuine smile spreading across my face. From a distance, something seemed off. It was in their posture. David stood with his back partially to the counter, his shoulders rigid, his focus entirely on the phone in his hand. Lauren was talking, her hands gesturing in that sharp, emphatic way she had when she was arranging things, her smile tight and fixed. And there was a third person with them. A young woman, her long, dark hair gleaming under the terminal's fluorescent lights, was laughing at something Lauren said. For a fleeting second, My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. A friend of theirs catching a different flight, perhaps. A colleague from Lauren's firm seeing them off? The hope I had so carefully constructed was a powerful fortress, and my mind was not yet willing to lower the drawbridge to doubt. I closed the distance, my footsteps light, my suitcase rolling obediently behind me. "There you are," I called out, my voice bright with an excitement I couldn't contain. David looked up from his phone. The smile on my face faltered. There was no answering warmth in his eyes, no relief, no happiness. There was only a flicker of something I couldn't name: annoyance? Panic, before his expression smoothed over into a cool, neutral mask. He didn't move toward me. He didn't open his arms for a hug. He just stood there, a sudden stranger in the familiar shape of my son. Lauren turned, her practiced smile clicking into place. "Tony, you made it." It wasn't a welcome, it was an acknowledgement of a fact, like noting the time on a clock. The young woman beside her turned as well. She was beautiful, in that effortless, sun-kissed way of the perpetually young. And as I got closer, I saw that her carry-on bag, a stylish leather tote, was a perfect match to Lauren's. They looked like a set. A pair. A team. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. "Hello," I said, my voice a little less certain now. I looked from Lauren to the stranger, then to David, searching for a cue, an explanation that would make the picture in front of me make sense. "Mom, this is Maya," David said, his tone flat, informational. "Lauren's friend." "So nice to meet you," Maya chirped, her smile dazzling. "I've heard so much about you." The cold knot tightened. The check-in agent, a tired-looking woman with a name tag that read Brenda, looked from the manifest on her screen to our small, tense group. "I have a David, a Lauren, and a Maya Gardner here for Flight 347 to Maui." Just the three? My world, which had been so full of color and light just moments before, began to drain into a dull, humming gray. I looked at the clipboard in Brenda's hand, and that's when I saw it. My name, Tony Anderson, was there. And beside it, a cheap ballpoint pen was tied to the counter with a beaded string. David cleared his throat, finally taking a step forward, not to greet me, but to address the agent. He picked up the pen. "Actually," he said, his voice shockingly casual, "there's been a change of plans." And then I heard it. The sound. The small, definitive scrape of the pen tip against the paper. A thin, black, brutal line drawn straight through my name. The sound of my own undoing. He didn't even look at me as he did it. He simply wrote Maya in the space beside the black slash mark. My gaze was fixed on that line. It was so final. So absolute. The coral dress felt garish now, a costume for a pathetic old fool. The pearls around my neck were suddenly heavy, a cold, dead weight. The hum in my ears grew louder, a thick, syrupy static that muffled the surrounding noise of the airport. The fortress of hope didn't just crumble, it was obliterated in a single, silent explosion. "David?" The name was a fragile whisper. I was begging, pleading with my eyes for him to look at me, to tell me this was a joke, a misunderstanding, anything but what it so clearly was. He finally turned to me, his face a carefully blank canvas. "Mom, we're just doing immediate family on this trip," he said. The words were nonsensical. They didn't compute. Immediate family? I was his mother. I was the one who had held him, fed him, taught him to walk. I was the one who had sat with him through fevers and celebrated his every triumph. I was the very definition of immediate family. The phrase, coming from his lips, was a weapon. He was redefining the word to exclude me, right here, in front of a tired stranger and the smiling girl who was taking my place. Lauren, ever the diplomat of my marginalization, stepped in smoothly. She placed a hand on my arm, her touch light but proprietary, as if handling a delicate but problematic antique. "Tony, we were going to call you," she lied, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "It was a last-minute decision." We've planned so many strenuous activities, that long hike up the volcano, the surfing lessons. We were just worried about your safety, about your energy levels. It wouldn't be fair to you to have you come all this way and not be able to participate in everything." Her words were a masterclass in polite cruelty. Each one was a carefully aimed dart, dipped in the poison of ageism and condescension. Safety. Energy. Not fair to you. She wasn't protecting me, she was judging me, sentencing me as feeble and incapable without a trial. She was telling me I was a burden. An obstacle to their fun. My mouth was dry. I couldn't form a sentence. All the things I had imagined saying to them, the jokes, the stories, the words of love, turned to ash in my throat. And then, the final, exquisite twist of the knife. Maya, the replacement, stepped forward. Her face was a perfect mask of sweet, concerned sympathy. "Tony," she said, her voice soft and earnest, "I'm so sorry about the mix-up. But thank you so much for being so understanding. Really, thank you for making this possible." Making this possible. There it was. The narrative, rewritten. I wasn't the victim of a bait and switch, a cruel and calculated betrayal. No, I was a benevolent benefactor, a generous soul who had graciously stepped aside to allow this lovely young woman to go to Maui. My humiliation was being reframed as my choice. My pain was being erased and replaced with their gratitude. I looked at David, searching for any sign that he understood the profound horror of what was happening. There was nothing. He just nodded in agreement with Maya, a flicker of relief on his face that the unpleasantness was almost over. He pushed his phone into his pocket and picked up his carry-on. "Mom," he said, his voice returning to that clipped, transactional tone I knew so well, "could you just head home? We'd really appreciate it if you could water the plants while we're gone. The ficus in the living room needs it every 3 days. And maybe tidy up the house before we get back? It would be a huge help." And that was it. My grand return to the family. My transformation from a vibrant, hopeful woman in a coral dress to the help. The house sitter. The plant waterer. A function. A task on a list. Brenda, the check-in agent, who had witnessed the entire bloodless execution with practiced indifference, plastered a smile on her face. "All right, folks, have a wonderful flight to Maui." They turned to leave. My son, his wife, and the young woman who was living the week that was supposed to be mine. They walked toward the security gate, their matching luggage gliding smoothly behind them. They were a unit. A complete set. And they didn't look back. Not once. I stood there, frozen, the world slowly coming back into focus. The bright lights of the terminal seemed harsh and interrogating. The cheerful announcements over the PA system sounded like mockery. The bustling crowds of happy families, of couples, of friends embarking on adventures, they were all a part of a world I no longer belonged to. I was an island, a spectacle of one. The coral dress was a joke. The pearls were a lie. I could feel the hot, shameful tears beginning to well, and I prayed, with everything left in me, that they would not fall. Not here, not in public, not in the place where my heart had been so casually, so efficiently, and so completely broken. Time stopped, or perhaps it fractured, splintering into a million sharp-edged moments that I couldn't assemble into a coherent sequence. They were gone. The graphite gray suitcases had disappeared into the maw of the security line. The echo of Maya's cheerful, oblivious thanks still hung in the air, a toxic perfume. I was a statue carved from salt and shame, and the tide of the bustling airport was beginning to erode me. A voice, gentle but firm, cut through the static in my head. "Ma'am? Are you all right? Do you need some help?" I turned my head slowly. It was Brenda, the check-in agent. Her face, which had been a mask of professional indifference just minutes before, now held a flicker of genuine concern. She had seen it all. She had witnessed my public unnaming, my polite, brutal dismissal. Her pity was a spotlight, and I felt my skin burn under it. To be seen in this moment of utter desolation was a new and profound layer of humiliation. My voice, when it came, was a stranger's. It was thin, brittle, and impossibly calm. No, thank you. I'm fine. Just a change of plans. I used their words. A change of plans. As if it were my decision. As if I had any agency at all. The lie was a flimsy shield, but it was the only one I had. I could not bear for this stranger to know the full, pathetic truth, that I was a 6-9-year-old woman in a ridiculous coral dress, who had been deemed too old, and too inconvenient to go on vacation with her only child. Brenda's eyes held mine for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement that she didn't believe me but was kind enough not to challenge the fiction. She gave a small, tight nod and turned to the next family in line, her professional smile snapping back into place. The world moved on. I forced my legs to move. Each step was a monumental effort, a negotiation between my brain and a body that wanted to collapse right there on the polished linoleum floor. I pulled my suitcase behind me, its cheerful, hopeful contents now feeling like a collection of artifacts from a dead woman's life. The wheels made a hollow, lonely sound as I retraced my steps, moving against the current of excited travelers who were heading toward their gates, toward their lives. I was heading backward, back to the silence, back to the nothingness I had so foolishly believed I was escaping. The cab ride home was a blur. The sprawling, sun-bleached landscape of Los Angeles passed by the window, unseen. The driver tried to make small talk, something about the traffic, the weather. I responded with monosyllabic grunts, my gaze fixed on nothing. My mind was a broken machine, stuck on a loop, replaying the scene at the check-in counter. The scrape of the pen. David's empty eyes. Lauren's pitying smile. Maya's voice, "Thank you for making this possible." I had made it possible. I had made all of it possible. Their life, their matching luggage, their financial security. I had poured my life, my love, my resources into the foundation of my son's world. And they had just used those very bricks to build a wall to keep me out. When the cab pulled up to my apartment building, the place I had left only a few hours before with a heart full of light, it looked like a prison. The cheerful yellow door seemed to mock me. The potted geraniums on my small balcony, which I had watered that morning with such happy anticipation, now looked like funeral arrangements. I paid the driver, my hands moving with a slow, robotic detachment, and walked up the path. The key in the lock was a cold, hard finality. The door swung open into silence. A thick, suffocating silence that was so much heavier than the one I had left behind. Before, it had been a silence of anticipation. Now, it was a silence of absolute, irreversible loss. My apartment was exactly as I had left it. Tidy. Clean. Waiting for me to return with stories and souvenirs and a renewed sense of belonging. The first thing my eyes landed on was the cake, David's cinnamon orange cake. It sat on the kitchen counter under its plastic dome, a perfect, golden monument to my own stupidity. Its sweet, warm scent, which had filled me with such profound hope, now smelled like decay. It was the smell of rejected love. Of a mother's pointless, pathetic effort. I walked past it, unable to look at it any longer, and my gaze fell upon the refrigerator. And there it was. The final insult, left for me before they departed for their life of ease. A piece of crisp, white paper held in place by a novelty magnet shaped like a pineapple. It was a list. In Lauren's perfect, looping script, she had written out my instructions. Tony, things to do while we're away. The cheerful little smiley face was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive cruelty. 1. Water ficus mon, Thurs, BM, just a little. 2. Bring in mail daily stack on hall table. 3. Tidy up guest room closet needs organizing. 4. Accept grocery delivery wed between 2-4 p.m. 5. Enjoy the peace and quiet. See you in a week. L. Enjoy the peace and quiet. The words were a slap in the face. This wasn't a vacation for me. It was my life. The quiet was my constant companion, the silence my cellmate. She was framing my loneliness as a luxury, a gift she was bestowing upon me. Tidy up the guest room. Not my guest room. Theirs. The room in their house that I was apparently now expected to clean in their absence. My humiliation was so complete, so assumed, that she didn't even have to ask. She just listed it as a task, like taking out the trash. Something inside me, something deep and dormant, began to stir. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a colder, more primal rejection. My hand moved before my brain had fully processed the command. I reached out, my fingers closing around the crisp edge of the paper. I pulled. The magnet clattered to the floor. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I tore the list in half. The sound of the ripping paper was sharp and violent in the crushing silence of the apartment. It was a small sound, but it felt like a gunshot. I tore it again. And again, and again, until the pieces were too small to hold, a flurry of white, meaningless confetti that fluttered from my numb fingers onto the clean kitchen floor. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a plan. It was just a refusal. A single, desperate act of negation in a life that had become a constant, smiling affirmation of my own erasure. I stood there for a long time, staring at the scraps of paper on the floor. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The numbness was a mercy, a thick blanket of fog that was rolling in to protect me from the full, searing pain of what had just happened. My phone buzzed on the counter. For a wild, insane moment, my heart leaped. It's him. He's calling to apologize. It was all a horrible mistake. Lauren made him do it. He's telling them to turn the plane around. The fantasies of a broken mind. I picked it up. It was a text. From David. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the screen. The message consisted of 5 words. 5 cold, practical, devastating words. Did you water the plants? That was it. No, I'm so sorry, Mom. No, I love you. No acknowledgement of the public vivisection he had just performed on me in the middle of an airport terminal. Just a logistical query. A follow-up on my assigned duties. I had been successfully demoted from mother to function, and he was simply checking to ensure the function was being performed. I stared at the screen, the black letters stark against the white light. And that's when the shame finally receded, washed away by a rising tide of cold, clear nothingness. The numbness was complete. The tears I had been fighting back at the airport never came. Crying required feeling, and I felt nothing at all. I was hollowed out. A shell. The woman who had packed her bags with such hope, the woman who had glowed in her coral dress, was gone. She had died right there at the Liberty Air check-in counter. I was just the ghost she had left behind, trapped in a silent apartment with a beautiful, useless cake and a list of chores that now lay in pieces on the floor. I had reached rock bottom. It was a quiet, desolate, and terrifyingly empty place. The numbness was a strange sort of comfort. It was a vast, gray, featureless landscape, and for a few hours, I wandered through it, untethered to feeling. I moved through my apartment like an automaton. I unpacked my suitcase, the one I had packed with such meticulous, hopeful care. Each item I removed was an accusation. The coral dress, now wrinkled from its brief, brutal journey, was the first to go. I didn't fold it. I didn't hang it. I let it fall from my hands into a heap on the floor, a splash of mocking, vibrant color in the muted room. The chic espadrilles followed, landing beside the dress with a soft, defeated thud. The carefully wrapped gifts for David and Lauren I simply dropped into the trash can, the sound of the crinkling paper, a final, pathetic sigh. I put away my toiletries. I stacked my book on the nightstand. I performed these mundane tasks with a slow, deliberate precision, my mind blessedly, mercifully blank. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not look at David's text message again. I simply existed in the quiet, sterile aftermath of my own demolition. Evening came. The sun, which I had imagined watching set over a glittering ocean in Maui, instead bled out behind the neighboring apartment buildings, casting long, lonely shadows across my living room floor. The silence in the apartment deepened, pressing in on me. The numbness, which had been a shield, was beginning to wear thin, and I could feel the first, sharp tendrils of pain beginning to snake their way through the fog. I found myself standing in front of the full-length mirror on my bedroom door. I hadn't consciously decided to go there. My feet had just carried me. For a long moment, I simply stared at the reflection, taking in the stranger who stared back. She looked old, not in the gentle, dignified way I had felt that morning, but in a brittle, exhausted way. The pearls, which I was still wearing, looked absurd, a touch of forgotten elegance on a woman who had been so thoroughly discarded. Her shoulders were slumped. Her eyes were dull. Her face was a pale, slack mask of shock. And as I looked at that woman, that pathetic, invisible creature in the mirror, something began to shift. It was a slow, tectonic movement deep beneath the surface of my grief. The question that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness finally broke through, sharp and clear. How did I let this happen? The question wasn't self-pitying. It wasn't the weak whine of a victim. It was a genuine, cold, hard inquiry. This hadn't happened in a single, brutal moment at an airport. The scene at the check-in counter wasn't the cause, it was the culmination. It was the final, logical outcome of 1,000 tiny surrenders, 1,000,000 small accommodations I had made over the course of decades. I saw my life spooling out behind me in the reflection. I saw myself as a young wife, the perfect wife, the one who always kept a spotless house and had dinner on the table at 6 sharp, who never burdened her husband with her own ambitions because his career was more important. I saw myself as a young mother, the perfect mother, the one who volunteered for every bake sale and school trip, who sublimated her own needs so completely into her child's that she forgot she even had them. My identity had been defined by my utility to others. I was Richard's supportive wife. I was David's devoted mother. My value was measured in how seamlessly I could meet their needs, how efficiently I could smooth their paths, how quietly I could disappear into the background of their lives. I had been the family's shock absorber. When David got into a fender bender in college, I was the one who dealt with the insurance, who found the repair shop, who quietly paid the deductible from my own small savings so his father wouldn't be angry. When he and Lauren wanted a down payment for their first condo, I was the one who cashed in the bonds my own parents had left me, telling them it was just a gift, never mentioning the future security I was sacrificing. When Lauren decided, 2 weeks before their wedding, that she hated her dress, I was the one who stayed up for 3 straight nights, my fingers raw, meticulously altering the beadwork, saving her from a crisis of her own making. My role was to be the silent, invisible helper, the fixer, the provider. And I had played it perfectly. I had been so good at it, in fact, that they had stopped seeing a person at all. They saw only a resource, a function. And when the function was no longer convenient, when it threatened to have needs or desires of its own like a place on a family vacation, it was simply eliminated. The pain that had been threatening to break through the numbness finally did, but it wasn't the soft, weeping grief I had expected. It was something else entirely. It was a clean, hot, purifying rage. It wasn't the hysterical, flailing anger of a woman wronged. It was a cold, quiet, and utterly lucid fury, the fury of a woman waking up. My gaze in the mirror sharpened. My shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, slowly began to straighten. The fog in my head evaporated, replaced by a diamond-hard clarity. They had not done this to me. I had allowed it. I had trained them to treat me this way. With every swallowed opinion, every cancelled plan of my own to accommodate theirs, every check I wrote without question, I had been teaching them that my needs didn't matter. I had been asking for their permission to exist in my own family. And today, permission had been denied. My eyes fell to the heap of fabric on the floor. The coral dress, moving with a newfound purpose, I bent down and picked it up. The linen was soft and cool in my hands. I shook it out, the wrinkles falling away. I stripped off the sensible, invisible clothes I had changed into and slipped the dress back on. It settled over my body, no longer a clown's costume, but a suit of armor. I turned back to the mirror. The woman I saw now was different. The exhaustion was still there, etched around her eyes, but it was overlaid with something new, a spark. A glint of steel. The dress didn't look mocking anymore. It looked defiant. It was the color of a sunrise, not a sunset. It was the color of a beginning. I thought of David's text message again. Did you water the plants? The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it. The complete and utter disconnect from the reality of the wound he had just inflicted. He didn't see me as a human being experiencing pain. He saw me as a malfunctioning appliance that had failed to perform its designated task. I walked back into the living room, my movements no longer robotic, but crisp and decisive. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could write 1,000 things. I could pour out my heartbreak, my rage, my decades of silent sacrifice. I could beg him to understand. I could curse him for his cruelty. I did none of those things. Instead, I typed a single word, a word I had not used with my son in 30 years. A word that had been erased from my vocabulary by a lifetime of perfect, selfless motherhood. No. My finger pressed send before I could second-guess myself. The message delivered instantly. A small, blue, definitive checkmark. It was a period at the end of a very long sentence. It was a door slamming shut. It was the first brick I had ever laid in the foundation of my own life. I set the phone down on the counter, face down. I did not want to see his response. I did not care what it was. Whether it was confusion, or anger, or another blandly logistical query, it no longer mattered. His opinion of me, his approval, his permission, I was revoking their power. I stood in the center of my silent apartment, the coral dress whispering around my ankles. The peace and quiet that Lauren had so condescendingly wished upon me was still there, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer the silence of absence and loss. It was the silence of a held breath. The charged, electric quiet before the storm. A storm that I, and I alone, was about to unleash. The ghost in the apartment was gone. Tony Anderson was finally, terrifyingly, and gloriously awake. The single word, no, hung in the digital ether between my phone and my son's. It was a declaration of war, whispered into the vast, indifferent universe of fiber optics. I had no strategy, no plan, only the raw, nascent power of that one refusal. I stood in my living room, the coral dress a silent testament to my newfound defiance, and waited for the world to shift on its axis. It did, but not in the way I expected. My mind, finally cleared of the fog of grief and shock, began to work in a way it hadn't in years. It was no longer occupied with David's schedule, Lauren's preferences, or the logistics of maintaining their comfortable lives. It was, for the first time since Richard's death, entirely my own. And in that new, uncluttered space, a memory surfaced. It was a small, dusty memory, packed away in the attic of my mind for 5 long years, deemed irrelevant to the life I had been living. A shoebox. It wasn't just any shoebox. It was an old, faded Florsheim box from the 1982, the cardboard soft and worn at the corners. Richard had kept it tucked away on the highest shelf of our bedroom closet, behind his winter coats and a stack of old photo albums. I had come across it a few months after he passed, while I was sorting through his things in a haze of sorrow. I'd opened it, expecting to find old receipts or sentimental trinkets. Instead, I had found a confusing jumble of corporate-looking documents, bylaws, stock certificates, incorporation papers for a company I'd barely heard of. At the time, the legal jargon was impenetrable, my grief too raw to allow for focus. I'd seen the words Liberty Air, a small regional airline Richard had dabbled in as a passion project decades ago, and had assumed it was a defunct business, a relic of a dream he'd let go. Overwhelmed and exhausted, I'd simply closed the lid, pushed the box back onto the shelf, and forgotten all about it. In the lonely years that followed, As I downsized from our family home to this small apartment, the box had come with me, a piece of forgotten history stored in the back of my own closet. Now, the memory of that box returned with a stunning, electrifying clarity. Why had he kept it? Richard was not a sentimentalist about failed businesses. He was a pragmatist. If a venture was dead, he buried it and moved on. The fact that he had kept that box, hidden but not discarded, suddenly seemed significant. A current of pure adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through me. I moved with a speed I didn't know I possessed, the coral dress swirling around me. I went to my closet, pulled a stool over, and reached up to the high shelf. There it was, behind a stack of sweaters I never wore. The faded Florsheim box. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it down. It felt heavier than I remembered, weighted with a significance I was only now beginning to comprehend. I sat on the edge of my bed and lifted the lid. The same collection of documents greeted me, but this time, I was not looking at them through a veil of grief. I was looking at them with the cold, clear eyes of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I sifted through the papers, the dry, brittle rustle the only sound in the room. Stock certificates, quarterly reports from the early 92nds, the original articles of incorporation. And then I saw it. Tucked at the very bottom, in a crisp, sealed manila envelope, was a single, folded letter. On the front, in Richard's familiar, angular script, were 2 words, for Tony. My breath caught in my throat. This was not a business file. This was a message. My fingers, now clumsy with a mixture of fear and hope, tore open the envelope. The letter was dated just 3 months before his fatal heart attack. He had known, somehow, that his time was short. He had been preparing. He had been trying to protect me. I unfolded the single sheet of paper. My dearest Tony, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I am sorry. I am sorry for leaving you to navigate the world alone. I know the last few years have been difficult, watching David build his own life. I see the way you make yourself small to fit into the spaces they leave for you, and it breaks my heart. You have always been the strongest person I know, and I fear you have forgotten it. I am writing to you about Liberty Air. I know you thought I sold it off years ago. I never did. I let the world think it was a small, struggling charter service, but that was a fiction I maintained for our privacy and, frankly, for our safety. After a few early successes, I realized its potential was enormous, but so were the risks. I didn't want us to become targets. So, I set it up to run itself. I put a structure in place, a good man at the helm, and let it grow quietly, under the radar. Tony, the airline is not a memory. It is a thriving, national enterprise. And it is yours. Completely. The documents in this box are the original proofs of ownership, but the real control lies in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank downtown. The key is taped to the bottom of this shoebox. The access code is your birthday. Inside, you will find everything you need: the updated deeds, the unassailable legal titles, the account numbers for assets that I have shielded from everyone, including our son. I did this for you. Not for David. I love our boy, but I see his weakness for Lauren's ambition. I did not want your future to be in their hands. I wanted it to be in yours. There is a man named Gus Mendoza. He has been the CEO for the last 15 years. He is loyal, he is brilliant, and he is waiting for your call. His number is in the envelope. He has been running the company according to my long-term plan, waiting for the day you decided to step out of the shadows. This is your legacy, Tony. Not as my wife, not as David's mother, but as you. Don't be afraid of it. Don't let anyone tell you that you are not capable. You were always the wind beneath my wings. It's time you remembered you own the entire sky. All my love, forever, Richard. I read the letter once. Then twice. The words shimmered through the tears that were finally falling. But these were not tears of shame or humiliation. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering love. He had seen me. All this time, when I thought I was becoming invisible, he had seen me. He had known, with a husband's painful prescience, exactly what would happen, and he had built me an ark. The numbness, the rage, the pain, it all coalesced into a single, powerful emotion. Gratitude. My hand went to the bottom of the shoebox. My fingers brushed against a small, metal key, held in place by a piece of yellowed tape. It was real. All of it. I looked at the woman in the mirror again. The reflection was the same, but everything had changed. The pearls around my neck were no longer just a memory of his love, they were a symbol of his faith in me. The coral dress was no longer an act of defiance, it was my coronation robe. I had been living a frugal, careful life on Richard's modest pension and our social security, clipping coupons and worrying about rising utility bills. I had been making myself small, not just emotionally, but financially, believing I had to be careful, believing I was a burden they would one day have to shoulder. The irony was so immense, so staggering, it was almost comical. While I was dutifully watering their ficus tree and organizing their closets, I had been the silent, unknowing owner of a national airline. While Lauren was lecturing me about my energy levels, I possessed assets that could likely buy and sell her entire world 100 times over. They thought I was a powerless old woman to be managed and discarded. They had built their entire life on the assumption of my weakness, my dependence, my insignificance. They had drawn a line through my name, confident that it had no value. They had no idea that my name was the one that signed the checks. My name was the one on the deed. My name was the one that held all the power. I found the small slip of paper with Gus Mendoza's name and number. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up my phone. The message I had sent to David No had been a spark. Richard's letter was a barrel of jet fuel. The fire was just beginning. And my son, sunning himself on a beach in Maui, had no idea he was about to be burned. The phone felt both impossibly heavy and wonderfully light in my hand. It was no longer just a device for receiving dismissive text messages about houseplants. It was a scepter. Gus Mendoza's name and number, written in Richard's steady hand, seemed to hum with a latent energy. For 5 years, this man had been a ghost, a name in a forgotten box, silently stewarding my empire while I clipped coupons and scheduled my life around my son's fleeting availability. He had been waiting for a call from a woman who hadn't even known she was supposed to make it. I took a deep, steadying breath, the air in my quiet apartment, suddenly tasting different, sharper, cleaner, full of possibility. The woman who had been afraid to bother her own son for a moment of his time was gone. In her place was a woman holding the keys to her own kingdom. I dialed the number. It rang only once. A man's voice, calm and measured with an undercurrent of warmth, answered. Gus Mendoza speaking. There was no assistant, no automated menu. Just the direct, confident voice of a man in charge. My own voice, when it came, was steady. The thin, brittle tone of the victim at the airport had vanished, replaced by a quiet authority I didn't know I possessed. Mr. Mendoza, I said, my name is Tony Anderson. Richard Anderson was my husband. There was a pause on the other end of the line, but it was not a pause of confusion. It was a pause of profound, respectful silence. I could almost feel him sitting up straighter in his chair, 1,000 miles away. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, imbued with a reverence that sent a shiver down my spine. Mrs. Anderson, he said, and the way he said my name, not Tony, not sweetheart, not mom, but Mrs. Anderson, was a balm to my raw, wounded soul. It was a title of respect, of power. I have been waiting for this call for 5 years. The simple, unadorned truth of that statement hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had been waiting. Richard had trusted him, and he had honored that trust. He hadn't tried to seize control, hadn't liquidated assets, hadn't betrayed the silent legacy left in his care. He had simply waited. For me. Richard left me a letter, I explained, my voice catching for just a second on my late husband's name. He explained everything. About Liberty Air. About my ownership. He was a brilliant man, Gus said, his voice full of genuine admiration. And a very private one. His instructions were explicit. The company was to continue its growth trajectory under my management until such time as you, and only you, made contact. He wanted your future to be your decision, on your timeline. My timeline. For years, my timeline had been dictated by others. Holidays were scheduled at Lauren's convenience. Weekends were kept open in case David needed me to dog sit. My life was a series of empty squares on a calendar, waiting to be filled in by their needs. Richard, in his infinite wisdom, had given me the ultimate gift, a timeline of my own. I need to understand what it is I own, Mr. Mendoza, I said, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on my tongue. Richard's letter was a summary. I need the details. Of course, Mrs. Anderson, he replied, and I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clicking. Let's start with the basics. Liberty Air is not the small, regional charter service the public records might suggest. That's a corporate shield, just as Richard designed. In reality, we are a profitable, privately held national carrier. We currently operate a fleet of 68 Boeing 737 seconds. Our primary routes connect major hubs LAX, JFK, O'Hare, Atlanta, but our most profitable sector is the leisure market. I sank down onto the edge of my bed, the faded shoebox resting beside me. 68 Boeing 737 seconds. The number was abstract, impossible to grasp. I had been worried about the cost of a cab to the airport. Gus continued, his voice a calm, steady river of information that was washing away the wreckage of my old life. Our specialty is the luxury vacation package. We have exclusive, long-term contracts with a dozen high-end hotel chains in Hawaii, the Caribbean, and Mexico. We don't just sell seats, Mrs. Anderson, we sell experiences. First-class transport, VIP ground transfers, suite-level accommodations. It's a high-margin, low-volume model, and it has proven exceptionally resilient to market fluctuations. Hawaii. My son, my daughter-in-law, and her yoga friend were, at this very moment, flying to Hawaii. A bitter, ironic laugh almost escaped my lips. Financially, Gus went on, oblivious to the personal cataclysm that had prompted my call, the company is healthier than it has ever been. We are debt-free, our cash reserves are substantial, held in a diversified portfolio of assets that I manage personally, according to Richard's conservative investment strategy. Your personal holdings, tied to the company's value, are significant. How significant? I asked, my voice a whisper. There was another brief pause. Forgive me for being indelicate, Mrs. Anderson, but have you been living frugally? The question was so unexpected, so deeply insightful, that it took my breath away. Yes, I said. On a pension. I had no idea. I see, Gus said, and his voice was now laced with a fierce, protective indignation that was entirely on my behalf. Richard would be displeased. To be blunt, you are one of the wealthiest women in California. Your net worth is in the high 9 figures. You have been living like a pauper in your own castle. 9 figures. The words didn't even register as a real number. It was a concept, a fantasy. I looked around my small, tidy apartment. The sensible beige sofa I had bought on sale. The slightly threadbare Persian rug that had been a wedding gift 50 years ago. The prints on the wall that were cheap reproductions of famous paintings. I had been living a life of careful, quiet austerity while sitting on a fortune beyond my wildest imaginings. The full, staggering truth of my situation finally landed. I wasn't just wealthy. I wasn't just the owner of a company. I was in control. The power Lauren wielded over me, the power of social approval and emotional manipulation, was a child's toy compared to this. The power David held, the power of a son's love that he doled out in tiny, conditional portions, was a flickering candle against the sun. Richard's final gift wasn't just the money. It was the power. He hadn't just left me a safety net, he had left me a throne. Mrs. Anderson? Gus' voice brought me back from the brink of a dizzying revelation. Are you still there? Yes, I said, and my voice was no longer whispering. It was clear and resonant. Yes, I am here. A decision, which had been forming in the deepest parts of my subconscious since I had read Richard's letter, now rose to the surface, fully formed and unshakable. The years of being passive, of waiting for an invitation, of asking permission, were over. My timeline had officially begun. Mr. Mendoza. Gus, I corrected myself, I need to know something. My son, David Anderson, is currently on one of your flights. Liberty Air Flight 347, from LAX to Maui. He is traveling with his wife, Lauren, and her friend, Maya Gardner. I heard the rapid, efficient click of his keyboard. Yes, I see the passenger manifest. They are in first class, seats 2A, 2B, and 2C. Of course they were in first class, on my airline. Using a ticket that was, in essence, paid for with my money, on a trip from which I had been cruelly and deliberately excluded. The poetic injustice of it was so perfect, so complete, it was almost beautiful. I am going to the bank tomorrow to access the safe deposit box, I said, my voice now humming with a cold, controlled energy. I will sign whatever needs to be signed to assert my full, active control. But for now, I want you to do something for me. Anything, Mrs. Anderson, he said, his loyalty a tangible force across the phone line. You are the owner. I am at your command. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that were beginning to twinkle in the encroaching darkness. My city. My sky. I was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's life. I was taking the helm. I am stepping into my power now, Gus, I said, and the words felt like the truest thing I had ever spoken. And the first order of business is to make sure my family knows it. There is a unique and terrible vulnerability that comes with being suspended 38,000 feet above the earth in a pressurized metal tube. You are untethered from the world, in a liminal space between departure and arrival. You have surrendered all control to the crew, to the pilots, to the immutable laws of physics. It is, perhaps, the last place on earth you would want to discover that the very foundations of your life have turned to sand. I didn't have to imagine the scene on Liberty Air Flight 347 to Maui. I could picture it with a crystalline, agonizing clarity. They would be about 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific. The dinner service in first class would have just concluded. David, who always chose the steak, would be leaning back, his tie loosened, perhaps nursing a scotch and scrolling through market reports on his laptop. Lauren, ever conscious of her figure, would have picked at the salmon salad, and would now be sipping a crisp Sauvignon Blanc, flipping through a glossy magazine with a bored, proprietary air. And Maya, my replacement, would be giddy with the novelty of it all, perhaps watching a movie on the seatback screen, a blissful, unknowing smile on her face. They would be comfortable, secure, cocooned in the quiet, climate-controlled luxury that they believed they had earned, that they were entitled to. Their biggest concern at that moment would be whether the Mai Tais at the resort were as good as the ones they'd had in Cabo. They would be utterly, blissfully, and arrogantly unaware that their world was about to be tilted on its axis by a ghost they had left behind on the cold linoleum floor of LAX. What do you need me to do, Mrs. Anderson? Gus' voice was a calm, steady anchor in the swirling vortex of my thoughts. He wasn't questioning my motives, he was simply waiting for his orders. The unhesitating loyalty of this stranger was a more profound validation than any I had received from my own son in years. I took a moment, savoring the cool, clean taste of the power I was about to wield. Vengeance was a hot, messy emotion. What I was feeling was something colder, cleaner, and far more potent. It was the simple, elegant act of reasserting the truth. I wasn't seeking to destroy them, I was merely intending to introduce them to the reality they had so long ignored. Gus, I said, my voice as calm as his, I want you to get in touch with the captain of Flight 347. Captain Harrison, according to the schedule I see online. I can have him on a satellite line in 2 minutes, he confirmed. Excellent. I want you to authorize him to make an announcement. A special, mid-flight greeting. He is to welcome a few of his passengers personally. A smile touched my lips as I pictured the scene. An announcement from the captain was always a moment of minor drama on a flight. Passengers would lower their books, pause their movies, pull off their headphones. It commanded attention. And I was about to command their full, undivided attention. What should the announcement say? Gus asked, a hint of what sounded like grim satisfaction in his own voice. He was beginning to understand the shape of my justice. It should be simple, professional, and utterly unambiguous, I instructed. The captain is to address all the passengers. He should start with the usual pleasantries about the flight path and the weather, and then, he should say something like this. We'd also like to take this opportunity to extend a very special welcome to a few of our guests in the first-class cabin today. We are honored to have Mr. David Anderson, Mrs. Lauren Anderson, and Miss Maya Gardner on board with us. We hope you are enjoying your flight to Maui, a trip made possible by the extraordinary generosity of Mr. Anderson's mother. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, imagining them echoing through the quiet cabin. The owner of Liberty Air, Mrs. Tony Anderson. There was a moment of pure, unadulterated silence on the other end of the line. Then, Gus Mendoza let out a low, slow whistle. Mrs. Anderson, he said, and the admiration in his voice was absolute. That is surgical. Yes, I agreed. It is. I don't want it to sound vindictive. I want it to sound like a fact. A piece of company information. A simple, corporate welcome. Can you make that happen, Gus? Consider it done, he said. The call will be made in the next 5 minutes. The announcement will likely happen about 15 minutes from now. Thank you, Gus, I said. That will be all for tonight. I'll see you tomorrow morning after my visit to the bank. We hung up. I stood in my silent apartment, my hand still resting on the phone. 15 minutes. The countdown had begun. I closed my eyes and let the scene play out in my mind's eye. The gentle, electronic chime, followed by the captain's calm, authoritative voice crackling over the PA system. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harrison speaking. I could see the flicker of pleased surprise on Lauren's face as she heard her name. She would adore the public acknowledgement, the sense of being singled out as important. David would likely feel a touch of embarrassment mixed with pride, a confirmation of his status. Maya would just be thrilled. They would exchange small, self-satisfied smiles. Look at us. We're so special. And then, the final words would land. The owner of Liberty Air, Mrs. Tony Anderson. The smiles would freeze. The blood would drain from their faces. The half-eaten desserts and glasses of expensive wine on their tray tables would suddenly seem obscene. I imagined the wave of pure, unadulterated shock hitting them, a jolt more violent than any turbulence. It would be a disorienting, sickening lurch, the feeling of the floor dropping out from under you while you are already suspended in midair. I could see Lauren's perfectly composed features crumbling into a mask of disbelief, then horror, then incandescent fury. Her mind, always calculating, would be racing, trying to make sense of this impossible piece of information. Tony? The quiet, mousy woman we left to water the plants? The owner? It's not possible. It's a mistake. A cruel joke. David's reaction would be different. He would be hit with a tidal wave of shame so profound it would be physically sickening. Every dismissive word, every act of casual cruelty, every choice he had made to appease his wife at the expense of his mother would come rushing back at him, not as a vague memory, but as a fresh, gaping wound. The black line he had drawn through my name at the check-in counter would be seared onto the back of his eyelids, and Maya, poor, clueless Maya, would simply be terrified. Caught in the crossfire of a war she hadn't known was being waged, she would look from Lauren's furious face to David's ashen one, her dream vacation instantly transformed into a waking nightmare. The other passengers in the cabin, who had perhaps glanced over with mild curiosity, would now be staring, sensing the sudden, dramatic drop in the cabin's emotional pressure. There would be no escape, no place to hide, just the low hum of the engines and the dawning, catastrophic realization that the woman they had discarded was, in fact, the one who held all the cards. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the tabletop with a sudden, violent energy. It was almost exactly 15 minutes since I had hung up with Gus. I looked at the caller ID. Maya Gardner. I let it ring. I let the sound of her panic fill my quiet apartment. What could she possibly say? I'm sorry? I didn't know? Her ignorance was not an excuse, it was a symptom of the disease, of the casual, self-absorbed world they inhabited where other people, especially older women, were simply not real. It rang and rang, a desperate, unanswered plea from 38,000 feet. Finally, it stopped. A moment later, a text message appeared. Tony, I am so sorry, please call me. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Lauren is. She's not well. I read the message, a cold, grim satisfaction settling over me. She's not well. Of course she wasn't. Her carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of my money and her husband's weakness, had just been hit by a seismic shock. I typed a reply. My fingers were steady. There was no rage, no triumph. Just a simple, clear statement of the new reality. There is no misunderstanding, Maya. There is only the truth. Do not contact me again. I blocked her number. I was not interested in soothing her. I was not interested in managing Lauren's breakdown. My days as the family's emotional shock absorber were over. They had created this turbulence for themselves. They could ride it out on their own. My work for the night was done. The first shot had been fired, a precision strike delivered from a world away. They were trapped in their first-class seats for 3 more hours, with nothing but the truth and the endless blue of the Pacific for company. Tomorrow, I would go to the bank. Tomorrow, I would meet Gus. Tomorrow, I would begin the rest of my life. And for the first time in a very long time, I slept soundly through the night, a queen in her quiet castle, dreaming of the sky. Sleep, when it finally came, was a deep, dreamless void. I woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through my blinds, feeling more rested than I had in years. The heavy cloak of grief and humiliation I had been wearing since the airport was gone, replaced by a feeling of profound, almost unnerving, calm. The world had not ended. It had simply been rearranged into its proper order. My phone lay on the nightstand where I had left it. It was littered with notifications. A string of missed calls and frantic text messages, all from the same number, David. I had blocked Maya, but I had intentionally left the line to my son open. I knew he would call, and I knew I had to be ready to answer, not with anger or recrimination, but with the cold, hard clarity of the truth. I ignored the notifications for now. The battle on the airplane was won. Today was about securing the kingdom. The visit to the bank was an exercise in quiet, stunning revelation. The manager, a portly man named Mr. Abernathy, greeted me with a deference that was startling. Clearly, Gus had made a call. I was no longer just another elderly client, checking on her modest savings. I was an entity. He personally escorted me down to the vault, the silence of the chilled, subterranean room broken only by the click of his polished shoes on the marble floor. He used his key, then I used mine, the small, unassuming key from the bottom of Richard's shoebox. The heavy steel door of the safe deposit box swung open, revealing not a small collection of jewelry and bonds, but a cavernous space filled with meticulously organized binders and legal documents. It was the administrative heart of my empire, and Richard had made sure it was impregnable. For the next hour, Mr. Abernathy walked me through the contents. Title deeds to commercial properties I never knew we owned. Stock portfolios so vast and diversified they looked like a small country's treasury, and the master documents for Liberty Air the ones that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that I, Tony Anderson, was the sole, unencumbered owner of the entire enterprise. As I signed the documents that activated my full control, my hand did not tremble. My signature, which had felt so small and insignificant on checks for groceries, now looked like the signature of a queen. Each stroke of the pen was an act of reclamation. I walked out of the bank into the bright California sunshine, a woman reborn. The city of Los Angeles, which had felt so vast and alienating yesterday, now felt like my dominion. I was no longer a ghost haunting its sidewalks. I was the one who owned the buildings. It was only then, sitting in the back of a town car that Gus had arranged for me, that I allowed myself to look at David's messages. They were a perfect, predictable portrait of a man in freefall. The first texts, sent shortly after the captain's announcement, were a string of confused question marks. Mom, what was that? Is this a joke? Then, as the reality began to sink in, the tone shifted to disbelief and anger. You need to call me. Now. Lauren is having a panic attack. What did you do? And finally, as the hours wore on and his calls went unanswered, the anger curdled into a desperate, pleading fear. Mom, please. I'm sorry. Whatever is going on, I'm so sorry. Please just call me. We're about to land. I don't understand any of this. Please. The man who couldn't be bothered to send a single text of apology for publicly humiliating me had now sent 24 messages in the span of a few hours. The shift in power was so swift, so absolute, it was almost dizzying. As the town car whisked me downtown toward the gleaming high-rise that served as Liberty Air's headquarters, my phone rang again. It was David. This time, I answered. Mom? His voice was a raw, ragged whisper. I could hear the tinny sounds of an airport in the background, the announcements, the rolling luggage. They had landed. Yes, David, I said. My voice was calm, even, and utterly devoid of the maternal warmth he was accustomed to. I was not his mother in this moment. I was a power he was only just beginning to reckon with. What is going on? He pleaded. That announcement. Mom, people were staring at us the whole flight. Lauren is a mess. She locked herself in the bathroom. What did you do? The reflexive, blame-shifting nature of his question was so familiar, so ingrained, that I almost laughed. What did you do? As if I were the author of this crisis, as if his and Lauren's actions were merely a passive backdrop to my inexplicable, malicious act. I did nothing, David, I replied, my voice as cool and smooth as the polished marble in the bank vault. I simply allowed the truth to be spoken. A truth you have both been conveniently ignoring for a very long time. What truth? He asked, his voice cracking. That you own the airline. How is that even possible? Why wouldn't you tell me? Why would I? I countered. Would it have changed anything? Would it have stopped you from crossing my name off that list? Or was my worth to you always conditional, David? Was I only valuable as long as I was the quiet, compliant, endlessly giving woman in the background? There was a choked silence on his end. I could practically hear the gears in his mind grinding, trying to process a version of his mother he had never encountered before. It wasn't like that, he finally stammered. It was a misunderstanding. The trip, it was just stressful to plan. We were worried about you. I cut him off, my voice sharp and clear, leaving no room for the comfortable lies he was trying to spin. Stop. Do not insult my intelligence by calling this a misunderstanding. It was a choice. You made a choice to publicly discard me in favor of your wife's friend. You made a choice to treat me not as your mother, but as your house sitter. This wasn't about stress, David. This was about a pattern, a long, established pattern of disrespect that I have finally decided I will no longer tolerate. But, I love you, Mom, he said, the words sounding hollow, a desperate last-ditch appeal to an emotional connection he himself had severed. I'm sure you do, In your own way, I said, and the sadness in my voice was real, a final, fading echo of the mother I used to be. But your love has felt like a cage for a very long time. A cage of low expectations and quiet dismissals. I am letting myself out of that cage, David. I am starting a new life. And in this new life, I will not be a second-class citizen. I will not be an afterthought, and I will not be at the beck and call of a son who only remembers he loves me when he realizes I hold the power. He was crying now, soft, desperate sobs. What do you want me to do? He whispered. We're here. In Maui. What's going to happen? Nothing is going to happen, I said. You will have your vacation. In fact, I've made some arrangements to ensure it's a memorable one. This was the final piece of my strategy, the part I had arranged with Gus that morning. It was not enough to announce the truth, I had to demonstrate it. When you exit the terminal, I explained, there will be a black car waiting for you. The driver will have your name. He will take you to the resort. Your check-in has been handled. You'll find that your accommodations have been upgraded to the presidential suite. Your meals, your spa treatments, any excursions you wish to take, it has all been taken care of. There was a stunned silence. You did that? He asked, his voice full of disbelief. Yes, I said. I did. And at every turn, for the entire week, you will find that every single perk, every luxury, every complimentary bottle of champagne, will come with a small card. And that card will read, courtesy of Tony Anderson. I let that sink in. I wanted them to be surrounded by my name. I wanted my presence to be inescapable. I wanted them to understand, in the most tangible way possible, that the beautiful world they inhabited was not their own. It was a world that I had built, that I owned, and that I was allowing them to visit, entirely at my discretion. It was not a punishment. It was an education. I have to go now, David, I said, as the town car pulled up in front of a skyscraper made of glass and steel that bore the Liberty Air logo. I have a company to run. I hung up the phone before he could reply. I stepped out of the car and into my new life. Gus Mendoza was waiting for me in the lobby, a warm, respectful smile on his face. He looked at me, not as a frail old woman, but as his boss. His partner, his queen. The guilt I had expected to feel was entirely absent. In its place was a profound sense of rightness. I had not abandoned my son. I had simply stopped allowing him to abandon me, and in the process, I was finally, after 69 long years, coming home to myself. The first few days inside the walls of my own empire were a dizzying blur of briefings, balance sheets, and boardrooms. The headquarters of Liberty Air was a world I had never known existed, a humming hive of quiet ambition and corporate power. Gus Mendoza was my Virgil, guiding me through the intricate circles of the enterprise Richard had built. He introduced me to heads of departments whose names I didn't know, overseeing operations I couldn't have imagined. They all looked at me with the same expression, a mixture of awe, respect, and a healthy dose of fear. I was a myth who had just walked into the building, the ghost in the machine, suddenly made flesh. I listened more than I spoke, absorbing the language and rhythm of this new reality. I learned about fleet maintenance schedules, fuel hedging strategies, and the complex art of route profitability analysis. It should have been overwhelming, but it wasn't. It was invigorating. For the first time in my life, my mind was being challenged in a way that had nothing to do with anticipating the emotional needs of others. The problems were complex, but they were clean. They were about numbers and logistics, not about deciphering the subtext of a dismissive smile or the meaning of a day-long silence. But as the initial adrenaline began to subside, a different kind of challenge emerged, one that wasn't on any spreadsheet. It was the question of what to do next with the power I now held. The immediate crisis with David and Lauren had been handled, my point made with surgical precision. But the fallout was ongoing. My phone was a constant, silent testament to their unraveling. David had stopped calling, his last tearful plea having been met with the cool finality of my command. Now, There were only texts, each one a small, pathetic flare sent up from the wreck of his vacation. Mom, the suite is insane. This is all too much. Lauren won't leave the room. She just keeps crying. Everyone here knows. The staff. They look at us differently. Please, can we just talk? I need to understand. I read them all, my heart a strange, conflicted knot. There was a part of me, the mother I had been for 40 years, that felt a pang of something akin to pity, but it was a distant, clinical pity, the kind one might feel for a stranger who has made a series of very poor choices. The urge to soothe, to fix, to make it all better, was gone. That woman had died at LAX. The temptation, however, was to punish. It was a dark, seductive whisper in the quiet moments. I could ruin them. With a single phone call to Gus, I could cancel their return flight. I could freeze the joint bank account I still shared with David, the one into which I had so dutifully deposited money for his emergencies over the years. I could call the resort and have them presented with a bill for their presidential suite, a bill they could never hope to pay. I had the power to shatter the comfortable world they had built on my invisible foundations. The thought was intoxicating. It was the righteous fury of the wronged, the fantasy of every person who has ever been belittled, dismissed, or discarded. I could make them feel as small and as helpless as they had made me feel. It was that dark, glittering thought that led me to call Joan Miller. Joan was my oldest and dearest friend, a woman whose entire personality was a bracing tonic of unsentimental truth. We had met in a Lamaze class when we were both pregnant with our first and only children, and our friendship had been forged in the trenches of motherhood and sustained through the long, quiet campaigns of widowhood. Joan was a retired journalist, and she had retained a reporter's sharp, analytical eye and a complete intolerance for bullshit, especially the self-inflicted kind. While I had spent my life smoothing things over, Joan had spent hers uncovering the unvarnished facts. She picked up on the second ring. "Tony Anderson," she said, her voice a familiar, gravelly rasp. "To what do I owe the honor? Don't tell me you're calling from a payphone in Maui." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like stretching a muscle I hadn't used in years. "Not exactly, Joan. Can I buy you a drink? I have a story to tell you." We met that evening at a quiet, old-school cocktail bar downtown, the kind with dark wood, leather booths, and bartenders who knew how to make a perfect Manhattan. Joan was already there when I arrived, a half-empty glass of bourbon in front of her. She took one look at me as I slid into the booth and her shrewd eyes narrowed. "Good Lord, Tony," she said, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "What in God's name has happened to you? You look dangerous." And over the course of the next 2 hours, fueled by the best Manhattans I had ever tasted, I told her everything. I started with the hope, the coral dress, the cinnamon cake. I walked her through the brutal, public execution at the check-in counter. I described the numbness, the torn-up list of chores, the text message about the plants. And then, I told her about the shoebox, about Richard's letter, about Liberty Air, Gus Mendoza, and the captain's announcement over the Pacific Ocean. Joan listened, her expression unreadable, her gaze never leaving my face. She didn't interrupt. She just let me pour it all out, the whole ugly, beautiful, unbelievable story. When I finally finished, taking a long sip of my cocktail, she was silent for a full minute, swirling the ice in her glass. "Well, I'll be damned," she finally said, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across her face. "Richard Anderson. That magnificent, sneaky bastard. I always knew there was more to him than met the eye." "Tell me what to do, Joan," I said, the question raw and real. "There's a part of me that wants to burn their whole world to the ground." "Of course there is," she said, taking a sip of her bourbon. "That's the easy part. Vengeance is a sugar high. It's intense, it's satisfying, and then it's over. And you're left with nothing but the sticky residue and a sick feeling in your stomach. Is that what you want?" "I don't know what I want," I admitted. "I just know I don't want to be that woman anymore." The one who lets herself be erased. Good, she said, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Then you have a choice to make. You can either spend the rest of your life punishing them for what they did, which, by the way, will keep you just as tethered to them as you were before. Or, you can choose to live. Really, truly, gloriously live. A life so full and so brilliant that their small, petty betrayal becomes nothing more than a footnote, the boring little anecdote you tell about the day your real life began. Her words landed with the simple, profound force of truth. Revenge was a backward-looking emotion. It was about settling old scores. Living, truly living, was about the future. It was about growth. It was about becoming. So I should just let them get away with it? The old Tony, the one who craved harmony at any cost, whispered the question. Joan rolled her eyes. Don't be an idiot, Tony. They're not getting away with anything. You've already checkmated them. Every time they order a fancy cocktail by the pool, every time a hotel employee greets them with a fawning smile, they are being reminded, quietly and relentlessly, of who they are and who you are. They are living in a gilded cage of your making for a week. The perks aren't a reward, they're the bars of the cell. It's a quiet, elegant, and utterly devastating form of justice. Trust me, they're suffering. You don't need to do another thing. She was right. The constant, gentle reminders courtesy of Tony Anderson were a far more sophisticated and effective form of consequence than any loud, dramatic act of retribution. I wasn't attacking them. I was simply holding up a mirror, forcing them to see the reflection of their own choices, paid for by a woman they had deemed worthless. So, what now? I asked, feeling a sense of clarity, of purpose, beginning to settle in my soul. Joan's grin returned. Now you get to work. But not their work. Your work. Richard didn't leave you an airline so you could get revenge on your spoiled son and his grasping wife. He left it to you so you could remember who you are. So, who do you want to be, Tony Anderson? What does a woman who owns the sky do with the rest of her life? The question hung in the air between us, full of terrifying, exhilarating possibility. I thought about all the things I had put on hold, all the dreams I had deferred in the service of my family. The trip to see the cherry blossoms in Japan that I had cancelled because Lauren decided to host a last-minute brunch. The art history classes I had wanted to take but never had the time for. The quiet desire to simply sit in a cafe in Paris and watch the world go by. I want to travel, I said, the words surprising me with their simplicity and force. I want to see the world. Not as someone's mother, not as a tourist on a carefully managed itinerary. I want to see it on my own terms. Excellent, Joan said, raising her glass. And as your best friend, I feel it is my solemn duty to accompany you and make sure you don't do anything too sensible. A new plan began to form in my mind, a dream itinerary not commissioned by guilt or obligation, but by pure, unadulterated desire. Paris, Venice, Tokyo, places that had only ever been pictures in a magazine. Let them have their week in Maui, I said, a genuine smile reaching my eyes for the first time. Let them sit in their presidential suite and contemplate their choices. Joan clinked her glass against mine. And while they're doing that, she said, you and I will be commissioning a dream of our own. First class, naturally. I looked at my friend, her eyes sparkling with mischief and loyalty, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I had chosen. I was not choosing vengeance. I was not choosing to forget or forgive, not yet. I was choosing life. My life. And it was just beginning. While David and Lauren were marinating in their luxurious, 5-star humiliation in Maui, Joan and I were planning a revolution. A revolution. We sat in my apartment, which suddenly felt less like a quiet refuge and more like a temporary command center with maps, travel books, and a laptop open to the Liberty Air flight network. The feeling was intoxicating. For the first time in my adult life, I was planning a trip where the primary considerations were not someone else's dietary restrictions, nap schedules, or narrow windows of vacation time. The only question on the table was a gloriously simple one: where do you want to go? The answer, it turned out, was everywhere. Our departure, 1 week later, was a quiet but profound act of defiance. We stood at the very same Liberty Air check-in counter at LAX where my life had been so brutally dismantled. But this time, I was not a hopeful, supplicating guest. I was the owner. The check-in agent's eyes widened slightly as she saw my name, and a ripple of quiet, respectful efficiency spread through the staff. Our bags were tagged with priority and owner labels. We were personally escorted, not to the main security line, but through a private, expedited screening process I never knew existed. Walking through the terminal, I felt a strange sense of temporal vertigo. I was walking the same path I had walked just 2 weeks earlier, but I was a different woman. I wasn't wearing the coral dress that was now sealed in a garment bag at the back of my closet, a historical artifact from a life that no longer belonged to me. Instead, I wore a pair of tailored cream trousers and a simple black cashmere sweater. I was comfortable. I was elegant. I was in charge. The pearls were still around my neck, but now they felt less like armor and more like a medal. Our first-class seats on the flight to Paris were not just seats, they were private pods, cocoons of soft leather and polished wood. As I settled in, a flight attendant whose name tag read, Eleanor, leaned in with a warm, genuine smile. "Mrs. Anderson," she said, her voice a respectful murmur, "welcome aboard. Mr. Mendoza let the entire crew know you would be traveling with us. It is an absolute honor to have you. May I bring you a glass of champagne before we depart?" I looked at Joan, whose eyebrows were arched in wry amusement, and I felt a smile touch my own lips. This was more than just good service. This was a reframing of my identity. On this airline, I was not an inconvenience. I was not a burden. I was the source. My worth was not up for debate. It was the foundational truth of the entire operation. Every smile from the crew, every perfectly presented meal, every small, thoughtful gesture was a quiet affirmation of my existence and my value. The text messages from David had trickled to a halt after a few days. My brief, clear responses, "I am not available to discuss this now. We will talk when I am ready," had left him no room to argue or plead. The silence was a new kind of boundary, a solid wall where there had once been a perpetually open door. He and Lauren returned from Maui to a world that was subtly, but irrevocably, altered. I had arranged for a car service to pick them up, another quiet reminder of the source of their comforts. I had not, however, arranged for the ficus in their living room to be watered. Let them tend to their own garden for a change. As our plane soared over the Atlantic, I felt the last vestiges of the old Tony slough away. She was the woman who worried, the woman who accommodated, the woman who shrank. The woman sipping champagne at 38,000 feet was someone else entirely. She was curious. She was calm. She was free. Paris was an awakening of the senses. Joan and I didn't rush. We didn't follow a rigid itinerary. We wandered. We spent an entire afternoon at a small cafe in Le Marais, doing nothing but drinking strong coffee and watching the impossibly chic Parisians walk by. It was the most gloriously unproductive day of my life. I had spent decades filling every moment with tasks for others. The simple, selfish act of being still was a revelation. We visited the Muséum d'Orsay, not to check it off a list, but because I wanted to stand in front of Monet's water lilies and simply look. I stood there for a full 30 minutes, letting the colors wash over me, feeling a sense of peace that had nothing to do with anyone else's happiness. From Paris, we flew to Venice. I had always dreamed of seeing it, but Richard had disliked crowds, and David had found the idea boring. Now, there was no one to veto my desires. Joan and I hired a private water taxi, gliding through the silent, ancient canals as the sun set, the golden light turning the decaying palazzos to honey. We ate fresh pasta and drank cheap, delicious red wine at a tiny trattoria, laughing until tears streamed down our faces, two old women unchaperoned and unburdened for the first time. It was in Venice that David tried to call again. I saw his picture flash on the screen as I was finishing a perfect tiramisu. The old impulse, the Pavlovian response of a mother to her son's summons, flickered for a brief second. I could feel the pull of his manufactured crisis, the weight of his emotional needs. Joan saw the look on my face. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice sharp as a stiletto. "That is the ghost of a guilt you no longer need to feel. You are in Venice. He is a grown man who can figure out his own life. Decline the call." I looked at the phone, then at the beautiful, impossible city around me, shimmering in the twilight. I pressed the red button. Call declined. I put the phone back in my purse. The tiramisu was exquisite. Our journey continued. In Tokyo, I discovered a love for the serene, ordered beauty of a Zen garden and the chaotic, electric energy of the Shibuya crossing. I, who had thought my palate was fixed for life, learned to love the taste of uni and the delicate art of a proper tea ceremony. I was not just a tourist, I was a student. The world was my classroom, and it was teaching me that my capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for taste, was not a finite resource that had been used up. It had simply been dormant. With each new city, each new experience, I felt myself expanding. The shame of the airport seemed like a story that had happened to someone else, in another lifetime. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been my companion for years was replaced by a quiet, confident peace. I was discovering that I was excellent company for myself. My thoughts were interesting, my preferences were valid, my desires were worthy of being fulfilled. Our final stop was the Maldives, a place so beautiful it seemed to defy reality. We had a private villa on stilts over a turquoise lagoon so clear you could see the brightly colored fish darting beneath the floorboards. For 5 days, we did nothing but swim, read, and talk. It was there, on our last night, sitting on our private deck under a blanket of stars so thick it looked like spilled diamonds, that I finally received a text message that was not from David. It was from Lauren. The message was short, terse, and stripped of all her usual synthetic sweetness. "My lawyer will be in contact with yours." I looked at the message, then out at the gentle, lapping water. It was the predictable move of a cornered animal. Lacking any emotional leverage, she was reaching for the only weapon she had left. Legal aggression. The old Tony would have been terrified. She would have been thrown into a panic, her mind racing with fears of ugly court battles, of family secrets being aired, of a final, irreparable schism. But the woman who had stood before Monet's water lilies and glided through the canals of Venice simply felt tired of the drama. I showed the text to Joan. She snorted into her wine glass. "Oh, that's adorable," she said. "She's going to sue you for what? For being the secret, benevolent owner of the airline she flies on? For giving her a free vacation in a presidential suite? What a fool." "She's not a fool, Joan," I said quietly. "She's just run out of moves." I thought about how to respond. A part of me wanted to send back a scathing, dismissive reply. But what was the point? I no longer needed to win the argument. I had already won the war, simply by removing myself from the battlefield. I typed a calm, simple response, not to Lauren, but to David. It was time for this chapter to end. "David, I will be home in 2 days. I have instructed my lawyer that I am willing to meet with both of you. But understand this, it will not be a negotiation. It will be a statement of the new terms of my life. You can either choose to accept them or not. The choice is yours." I hit send and put the phone away. The warm breeze coming off the Indian Ocean felt like a benediction. The journey of rebirth was over. It was time to go home and begin the work of living. Returning to Los Angeles was not the jarring re-entry I had anticipated. The city, which had once been the backdrop to my small, circumscribed life, now felt like a canvas waiting for me to paint on it. The month I had spent abroad had fundamentally rewired my perspective. I was no longer a satellite orbiting David and Lauren's world. I was a son, and they were, at best, a distant, rocky planet whose gravitational pull I no longer felt. The meeting was set for a week after my return. Not in a stuffy lawyer's office, and certainly not in the sterile, emotionless territory of my old apartment. I chose the venue with deliberate care, a large, airy conference room on the top floor of the Liberty Air headquarters. It was a place of power. My power. The room had a single, massive window that offered a panoramic view of the city, a sprawling, glittering tapestry that stretched to the hazy line of the Pacific. I wanted them to feel small against the backdrop of the world I now commanded. I arrived early, with Gus at my side. He wasn't there as a CEO, but as a quiet, steady presence, a witness. I was dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored navy blue suit, the color of authority, not invisibility. When David and Lauren were shown in, the change in their demeanor was stark and immediate. David looked diminished. The easy, casual confidence he had always worn like a second skin was gone, replaced by a deep, weary uncertainty. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He wouldn't meet my gaze, his eyes darting around the opulent room as if searching for an escape route. He looked like a boy who had been called to the principal's office, all bluster and defiance drained away, leaving only a hollow core of fear. Lauren, however, had chosen a different strategy. She had come dressed for battle. She wore a severe black dress, her hair pulled back in a tight, merciless chignon. Her face was a pale, rigid mask of composure, her expression one of polite, restrained fury. She was not here to apologize, she was here to assess the damage and negotiate the terms of her surrender. Her lawyer, a sleek, predatory-looking man in a suit that probably cost more than my old car, trailed in her wake like a pilot fish. They sat on one side of the vast mahogany table. I sat on the other. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint, distant hum of the city far below. Lauren's lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. "Mrs. Anderson," he began, his voice smooth and condescending, "we are here today to discuss an equitable solution to what has clearly been a significant family misunderstanding." I held up a single hand, a small, quiet gesture that nonetheless cut him off mid-sentence. "There will be no discussion of that nature," I said, my voice calm and even, a quiet counterpoint to the tension in the room. I looked past him, my gaze landing directly on my son. "I am not here to negotiate. I am here to tell you the truth, a truth I should have told you years ago." I let my eyes travel from David's pale, anxious face to Lauren's hard, defiant one. "For 40 years, I began, my entire identity was built around serving the needs of this family. I poured myself out, ounce by ounce, into being the perfect wife and the perfect mother. When your father was building his career, I was the one who made sure his home was a sanctuary, that his life was seamless, so he could focus. I gave up my own nascent career without a second thought, because that is what was expected. When you were born, David, my world shrank to the size of your needs. I celebrated every skinned knee as if it were my own, I baked for every school event, I stayed up late helping with every project. My joy was a reflection of your joy. My success was measured by your success, and I did it gladly. I did it because I loved you, and because I thought that was what love was, a complete and total act of self-erasure." I paused, letting the words settle in the silent room. "The problem is, I did my job too well. I made myself so useful, so accommodating, so utterly reliable, that you both forgot there was a person attached to the services. I became a function. The family ATM. The on-call pet sitter. The holiday caterer. The silent, smiling woman in the background of your perfect life." My gaze hardened as I looked at Lauren. "You, Lauren, were particularly adept at accelerating this process. You saw a system that was already in place and you perfected it, wrapping each dismissal in the language of concern, each demand in the guise of convenience. You made me feel that my age was a liability, that my presence was an inconvenience, that my very existence was something that needed to be managed." Finally, I turned my full attention back to David. His head was bowed, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. "And you, David," I said, my voice softening, not with pity, but with a profound, aching sadness. "You let it happen. You stood by and watched as I was slowly, politely, methodically pushed to the margins of my own life. You chose the path of least resistance. You chose your wife's comfort over your mother's dignity." The scene at the airport wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of 1,000 small betrayals that came before it. I leaned forward, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "The woman you discarded that day is gone. She is not coming back. You are now dealing with Tony Anderson. And these are the new terms of my life." I slid a thin file folder across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of David. "First," I said, "my finances are my own. The joint accounts will be closed. My will has been redrawn. You will not be the executor, and you are no longer the primary beneficiary. You will inherit a modest, protected trust, nothing more. The bulk of my estate will go elsewhere." Lauren made a small, choked sound, a gasp of pure, unadulterated outrage. Her lawyer placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Second," I continued, my voice unwavering, "I will be moving. I have already purchased a condominium downtown, 2 blocks from this building. The quiet, suburban life of the invisible helper is over. I will be taking an active role in the leadership of this company, sitting on the board, and overseeing the part of my legacy that truly matters to me." I pushed a second, thicker folder across the table. "Which brings me to my third and final term. This is the charter for the Anderson Foundation. It is a new nonprofit organization, endowed with an initial $50 million from my personal assets. Its sole mission will be to provide grants, mentorship, and legal support for American women over the age of 60 who are seeking to reclaim their lives, either professionally, personally, or creatively after a lifetime of service to others. My fortune will not be used to fund your lifestyle. It will be used to fund their liberation." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a world completely and irrevocably upended. Lauren's face was a mask of cold, white fury. Her lawyer looked stunned, all his prepared arguments and strategies rendered instantly obsolete. He had come prepared for a financial dispute, not a declaration of independence. David finally lifted his head. His face was streaked with silent tears. He looked at me, and for the first time since he was a small boy, I saw him. Not the successful man, not the dutiful husband, but the lost, broken child underneath it all. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I didn't know. I never knew." "You didn't want to know," I said, the truth of it sharp but not cruel. "It was easier not to. But now you do. And now you have a choice. You can accept these terms and we can begin the long, difficult process of building a new, and very different, kind of relationship, one based on respect, not obligation. Or you can fight me. And if you fight me," I let my gaze sweep over Lauren and her lawyer, "you will lose. And you will lose more than just money." I stood up, the meeting concluded. "I am not doing this to punish you," I said, my voice softening for the final time. "I am doing this to save myself. And, perhaps, to give you a chance to become a man who doesn't need his mother to be invisible in order to feel powerful." Gus opened the door for me. I walked out of the conference room and did not look back. The 6 months that followed were a whirlwind of focused, joyful work. The downtown condo became my sanctuary, a space filled with art and books that I had chosen. My role at Liberty Air was real and substantive. I didn't involve myself in the day-to-day operations. Gus was a genius at that, but I found my calling in steering the company's philanthropic efforts and its corporate culture. I championed family leave policies, mentorship programs for women, and partnerships with community arts organizations. I was building a company that reflected my own values. The Anderson Foundation became my heart's work. The applications poured in from women who wanted to start businesses, go back to school, write books, or simply have the resources to leave toxic situations. I read their stories, and in each one, I saw a reflection of myself. David, to his credit, chose the path of acceptance. He began therapy. Our conversations were stilted and awkward at first, the conversations of strangers learning a new language. But they were honest. He was, for the first time, doing the hard work of looking at himself. Lauren remained respectfully, frigidly, restrained. She understood the new power dynamic. The polite, dismissive smiles were gone, replaced by a cautious, watchful neutrality. The war was over, and she was a citizen of a new regime, abiding by its laws because she had no other choice. One afternoon, sitting in my new office, a message came through from the Foundation's director. It was a video link. I clicked on it. It was a short news segment about one of our first grant recipients, a 72-year-old woman from Ohio who had used her funds to open a small, independent bookstore in her town, a dream she had deferred for 50 years. She stood in her sunlit shop, her face radiant, surrounded by books, and said, "I feel like I'm finally living in color." Tears streamed down my face. They were not tears of sorrow or of anger. They were tears of profound, boundless, and hard-won joy. I was not just living my own life now. I was helping other women find theirs. And it was the most beautiful legacy I could ever have imagined. 2 years have passed since that day in the conference room. I am writing this from the deck of a sailboat, a sleek, white-hulled vessel named the Unmoored, currently anchored in a turquoise cove off the coast of Croatia. The sun is warm on my face, the Adriatic Sea glitters like a field of shattered sapphires, and the only sound is the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the cry of a distant gull. Joan is sitting across from me, her nose buried in a thick historical novel, a glass of chilled white wine sweating on the table beside her. This is not a vacation. A vacation is an escape from a life you need a break from. This, now, is simply my life. The world I inhabit today bears almost no resemblance to the one I left behind at Lax. That world was a small, quiet room of muted colors and muffled desires. This world is a vast, open landscape, painted in the vibrant, unapologetic colors of the coral dress I no longer need to wear. The journey from that room to this deck was not a straight line. It was a series of conscious, deliberate, and sometimes difficult choices to prioritize my own liberation over the comfortable fiction of my old life. Offers began to arrive in the months after the Anderson Foundation was launched. First, a local Los Angeles magazine wanted to do a feature on the jet-set philanthropist reclaiming her third act. Then came the national papers, intrigued by the story of the quiet widow who inherited an airline and started a movement. A producer from a major network called, wanting to discuss a documentary. A publisher from New York offered a book deal. Campuses from across the country invited me to speak on panels about reinvention after 60. At first, I refused them all. My privacy was a newfound treasure, and the thought of putting my story, my pain, on public display felt like a violation. Why should I give them that? I asked Joan one evening. I didn't do this for an audience. You're asking the wrong question, Shed replied, with her usual bracing clarity. The question isn't why should you give them your story, it's what could your story give to them, to the other women. The ones who don't have a secret airline waiting in a shoebox? The ones who think the silence they're living in is the only room there is? She was right. My story was no longer just mine. It had become a potential key for other women locked in similar rooms. So, I agreed. I did one interview, then another. I told the truth, without embellishment or bitterness. I talked about the slow, quiet erosion of self, the danger of becoming too useful, and the terrifying, exhilarating power of saying no. The response was a tidal wave. Emails and letters poured into the foundation, thousands of them, from women all over the country and, eventually, the world. They wrote from quiet suburbs in Ohio, from bustling cities in Texas, from small towns in the United Kingdom and Australia. They all said some version of the same thing. I thought I was the only one. You have given my feelings a name. My personal life found a new, quieter equilibrium. My relationship with David is a work in progress, a slow, careful reconstruction on a completely new foundation. He is still in therapy. He is learning to untangle his identity from his wife's ambitions and his mother's sacrifices. There are moments of staggering, painful honesty between us, conversations we could never have had before. He is beginning to see me not as a function, but as a person, with a past and a future that have nothing to do with him. It is a difficult, necessary education for both of us. There is love there, but it is a warier, more respectful love now, stripped of obligation and assumption. Lauren and I maintain a relationship of cool, correct distance. She is a woman who understands power, and I am now the one who holds it. The legal threats evaporated after that single meeting. Her lawyer had advised her, correctly, that she had no case. She now treats me with a careful, almost theatrical, deference. It is not warmth, and it is certainly not remorse, but it is, in its own way, a victory. She has not changed her nature, but I have changed the ecosystem in which she operates. Even Maya, the young woman who had been the unwitting catalyst for my awakening, reached out. She sent a long, handwritten letter to the foundation about a year ago. She had broken off her friendship with Lauren, she wrote, and had spent the last year reevaluating her own life, her own ambition, her own complicity in a system that so casually discards older women. She was, she said, trying to rebuild her life on more authentic terms. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "I know I don't deserve it, but I hope one day you can forgive me." I thought about that word, forgiveness. I have come to understand that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. It is not a grand absolution that wipes the slate clean. For me, forgiveness has been the quiet, personal act of letting go of the hope that the past could be any different. I no longer carry the weight of their betrayal. It is their burden to carry now, not mine. I replied to Maya with a simple, handwritten card. I wish you peace on your journey. The greatest gift of this new life has been the rediscovery of freedom without performance. For so long, my life was a performance for an audience of two, my husband and my son. I was playing the role of the perfect wife, the perfect mother. Now, there is no role. There is only me. There is a profound liberation in doing things simply because they bring me joy, with no need to justify or explain. I have taken up painting again, a passion I had abandoned in college. My canvases are terrible, amateurish messes of color and light, but they are mine, and the act of creating them fills me with a happiness that is pure and uncomplicated. I have found a community not of dependents, but of peers. The women on the board of the foundation, the other philanthropists, artists, and entrepreneurs I have met, they are my tribe now. We are women who have lived full lives, who have raised families and built careers, and who are now turning their considerable energy and wisdom toward shaping the world in a new way. We are not fading into a gentle twilight, we are stepping into our own brilliant, unapologetic sun. As I sit here on the deck of the Unmoored, my phone buzzes with an email from my publisher. They love the first draft of the book and want to discuss a speaking tour. Another email is from the Foundation's director, with a report on a new initiative providing seed funding for businesses started by women over 70. The world is full of work to be done, of beauty to be seen, of life to be lived. The final, unassailable truth of my story is this: the worst day of my life was the day that gave me back my life. The brutal, public humiliation at Lax was not an ending. It was a violent, necessary, and ultimately glorious awakening. It was the moment the universe, in its own cruel and mysterious way, took me by the shoulders and shook me out of the long, comfortable slumber of my own erasure. They thought they were writing me out of the story. They had no idea they were giving me the power to write my own ending and a magnificent new beginning. And I will spend the rest of my days living it, on my own terms, in the USA and far, far beyond. This story is for anyone who has ever felt invisible. For decades, my value was measured by my usefulness to others, a role I played until I was literally written off a list. But the greatest betrayals can become our greatest liberations. Your worth is not a gift from others, it is your birthright. Do not wait for an invitation to your own life. Stop asking for permission to take up space. The moment you realize your own power is the moment your true story begins. The sky, you will find, has been yours all along. Now, if you like this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.